Hi Year 12, I hope you're all well and that you are all staying safe and that you are all enjoying safely some of the lockdown measures that have been lifted this week. We've had a little bit of a... Oh, thanks Tanzila, just popped up in my lesson. We've had a little bit of a laugh and a joke about it this week about how I potentially choose which parent I meet outside, which is quite comical because my parents have 2 dogs and we have 1. So if ever you see my parents out walking, they're together, or it's my dad and my brother, or my mum and my brother, or usually my mum and dad. So it's impossible to only meet one of them outside. So we've had a little bit of a giggle this week about which one I choose, about how I pick my favourite parent, as the case may be. But anyway, so I hope you're all enjoying the kind of unlimited exercise that you can get out and have now, and the meeting up with one person from one other household, as long as you are 2 metres apart. So yeah, I am filming from a different room today, so I'm not in my kitchen because it's a bit of a mess, so I'm in my conservatory, so the light's a little bit funny, and it might make me look like a ghost or show all my greys up sitting out here, so I apologise for that. Anyway, so I said in the email yesterday that I wanted D1 handing in, and thank you to everybody that has submitted D1. I'm still waiting for a few of you, and I really, really need you to submit those. I've marked everybody else has had feedback on. The people that have submitted it have had feedback on it and then have resubmitted it and they've passed it. It's a very, very simple task. It shouldn't take you any more than half an hour. So I'm not really sure what the hold up is with those of you that still haven't handed that in, but that needs to be in by the end of Friday's lesson. Otherwise, it will go to the bottom of my marking pile when it does come in, and that may prevent you your progress into Year 13. So, yeah, it needs to be in by the end of Friday's lesson, please. So, D2 is another very, very simple task. It's summarise the milestones in epidemiology. It's very, very simple. It's quite short in terms of the detail you need to submit, but there is a lot of it. So, all of this we need to be covering. What I'm not going to do is cover all of that today. I'm not going to talk you through every single one of those today because you'll be bored of me. I will be bored of talking. It's 25 to 5 and I'm getting hungry. So I'm not going to talk through all of these today. But what I just wanted to talk you through today and what I wanted to get you started on, and the way I'm going to do this is to do this in parts. So we're going to do the first 4. Because I'm going to set you those. I'm going to get you to write those up. Submit that probably by the end of next Thursday's lesson. And then next Friday, then I will record the next 4, and you've then got the rest of Friday's lesson plus over Whitsun, and then whatever we have the first week back in June. So that's how we're going to do it. So it is basically just a summary of each of the milestones. So I'm going to go through them. So you may already know some of this, but this is purely what you need to write about. Okay, so you need to talk about Hippocrates. Now, he is credited as being the first person to believe that diseases were caused naturally and that they weren't caused as a result of, they weren't man-made, or they weren't people making things and then having them in a lab. He was the first person to say that diseases were all created naturally. And he was also the first person to separate religion away from medicine. So it wasn't anything to do with what your beliefs were. It wasn't anything to do with your religion. It was all to do with the environmental factors. So the area that you lived in, the type of housing you lived in, your diet and your living habits. So if you drank, you probably didn't then, but you know, that kind of thing, what sort of things you did within your own home, how you lived, whether you lived a very risk-free life or whether you lived a very risky life, that was all what he believed were what caused the diseases. Okay, and he believed that within a disease there was this crisis point, and that was a point at which the disease would either, or the illness would either win and the patient would die, or the patient would begin to recover. And that is still talked about now, but it's used as there's a different word for it, and it's going to drive me insane because I can't remember what it is. But for any of you that watch Grey's Anatomy, there is an episode in it when they talk about it, and I really can't remember what it is. I will find out and it will be in the email, because it talks about the point where a patient appears to be getting better, and then that usually means that, not always, but there is a point that appears the patient is getting better when they're terminal, and they're very lucid, they're very clear, they're very, clear in what they're saying, and then suddenly they die. And that it's very, very similar to the kind of thing that happened with my nan. So I've talked about my nan quite a lot in lessons. She had dementia. She's always been a bit mad, but she's been very forgetful. She's struggled at times over the past few years. She's got progressively worse. And then in the week before she died, she was actually very lucid, and probably the most lucid she's been for a very, very long time. So that word I will put in the email. He also talked about how it was important to give careful consideration to clinical observation and documentation. So you need all of that to be able to really chart a patient's illness, a patient's recovery, and that anybody else, any other doctor could pick that up and would be able to come to the same conclusion as you have. And he talked about categorising illnesses in the keywords that we still see now, so acute, chronic, endemic, and more importantly, and particularly importantly for this unit, epidemic. Okay, and there were a lot of symptoms for particular diseases that he recognised. He was the first person to recognise. So, for example, for lung cancer, he recognised swelling of fingers as being one of those things. For hemorrhoids, and he developed the use of a range of equipment to treat those illnesses, or lifestyle medicine. So, for example, for diabetes, he was the first person to really see that making lifestyle changes in terms of what you ate and what you drank and what you did in terms of how fit you were what could make you feel better or help you get better. Okay, so you just need to provide a summary of what I've said along with what's on there. Okay, so then you need to move on to the Black Plague. Now everybody knows about this, it's taught in history, or I would expect everybody to know about this, and to date, this is the most fatal pandemic that's ever been recorded in human history. Okay, so there were between 75 and 200 million deaths, and it was between 1346 and 1353. Now, it started in Asia, predominantly in China, and it then spread across the rest of Asia and then into Europe. Okay, and it was transmitted via rats and fleas, either, rat bites or fleas living on rats that then jumped onto humans. And what was very key in this particular pandemic was that hygiene was very, very poor, which meant that epidemics were kind of all the rage then anyway, but this was a particularly serious pandemic. And the symptoms included fever, headaches, painful aching joints, nausea and vomiting, like tumours that grew on their groins and places like that. And if it was left untreated, 80% of people died within 8 days of contracting it. And the symptoms, I think, usually started to develop between 2 and 7 days after you contracted it. Okay, so it was that was the most fatal pandemic recorded in human history. And when you're talking about it, that's really, really important to get across that this was the most fatal pandemic. Okay, now you'll laugh at me because I can't say this name, but Lee Euwenhoek, I can't say it, I apologise, I'm terrible. He was a Dutch doctor, and he was the person who started to explore microbial life. And he can almost be, what's the word I'm looking for, gifted with the invention of the microscope. So he made more than 500 optical lenses and at least 25 single lens microscopes. And he identified that if you magnified things, then you could see more about what they were, more about what caused them, more about what they look like, and potentially then start to think about how things could be defeated. And his main discoveries were obviously bacteria, and that the discovery of that bacteria came from inside a human's mouth. Spermatozoa, which is the male sex cell, and then banded pattern of muscular fibres. Okay, so on that one, think about how that would have helped the development of epidemiology. So think about, particularly now, if we didn't have that, you wouldn't be able to identify what coronavirus looked like. Okay, and that was really, really key in identifying the illnesses and diseases that then spread and caused mass pandemics. Okay. And then you've got the Industrial Revolution. Now, I'm not going to teach you about the Industrial Revolution because you don't need to know about it. What you need to know about are the key public health issues that developed as a result of that Industrial Revolution, okay? And the biggest ones were cholera, typhoid, typhus, smallpox, and TB or tuberculosis, okay? And the biggest issue was that they were a society of mass overcrowding, very high levels of poverty, very high numbers of peasants who couldn't afford to see doctors, okay, because remember the NHS didn't exist. back then, so doctors were paid for, so they couldn't afford to see doctors, and they relied on monasteries for medical help, and they obviously couldn't give the same medical help or medical treatment as doctors could. So that then amplified the illness even more, and it meant that people weren't going to the doctors, and then the illnesses were spreading. Because for those peasants who couldn't afford to see doctors, they also couldn't afford to not be working, so that the illnesses would spread. Okay. There was also a famine, which increased levels of crime, increased levels of disease and mass death, and not having anywhere for these dead people to go. They had very, very poor knowledge of how disease was passed on. So when you start talking about particularly cholera, the first belief was that that was passed on through air, and actually it wasn't. So they had very, very poor knowledge of disease, very, very poor levels of sanitation, and keeping people safe. Okay, so cholera was one of the most deadly diseases during the Industrial Revolution, and it was caused and spread by dirty and contaminated water. So every day raw sewage was being dumped into the River Thames, and then that water was then being taken out, and it was the main drinking source. Now, initially, they believed that cholera was airborne and that was how it was spreading so quickly. But the Dr. John Snow, he actually tracked the cases of cholera, and he plotted around where cholera was happening. And if you look back to the lesson we did last week, that's all about what epidemiology is. It's tracking what happens in a certain region, a certain area, whether that's a geographical region or whether that's, you know, whether it's London or Manchester, or whether it's this street compared to that street. But that's what he did, and he traced I forgot what I was going to say, but I forgot my words. He traced back where the most cases of cholera were occurring, and he then traced that back to a water pump within that area, which was obviously pumping the raw sewage from the Thames into that street or that area's water supply. And he then discovered that the true cause of cholera was indeed the water. And he developed, with the help of that, the germ theory, which is the most dominant and accepted theory of disease, and it's still the most dominant and accepted theory of disease today. And it kind of solidified how some diseases were passed on. Now, I will add in here, and I've got to be careful because I'm going to run out of time, but I will add in here, whether any of you saw it, but at the PM's questions on Wednesday, Boris Johnson, in his infinite wisdom, it might have been Monday actually, but in his infinite wisdom announced that they were tracking water supplies because they believed coronavirus was in water supplies, and that would help them trace where coronavirus was more prominent. They then had to issue a retraction because it isn't in the water supply. So if you saw that, don't panic, okay? So then there was TB, typhoid, and typhus. The greatest killer during this stage was TB, and that was spread. That wasn't spread by water; it was simply spread. It was airborne. It was simply spread by breathing, and people who were malnourished were particularly susceptible to it. And obviously, people still had very poor living conditions, and a lack of food or clean water meant people of all ages could catch TB. And then typhoid and typhus were made worse by the same living conditions. They were still there. It was made worse by how people lived. Typhoid was spread by infected water, and then typhus was carried on lice. Okay, so there are your main your first 4 milestones in epidemiology that I've kind of summarised a little bit for you today. So your task today is write a very, very short summary, and a paragraph on each one is more than enough about the milestones that we've discussed. So Hippocrates, the Black Plague, the guy whose name I can't pronounce, which makes me a terrible person, and then Industrial Revolution, and particularly a focus around cholera, TB, typhus and typhoid. Okay, so you've got the information that I've given you, that I've talked you through. So if you just watch this through and listen, then my advice would be go back through and make notes, and then you've got the information on your slides as well. And I have about 40 seconds before this video is going to stop, so I am going to stop. I'm going to say goodbye, and hopefully I will see you all soon.